We will move on to the next program. It is my pleasure to welcome Mr. Tetsuya Watanabe, President of Area, on stage.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure for AREA to share our perspective as a regional think tank with particular focus on the ASEAN. In the ASEAN, per capita GDP is still far below that of developed countries. Economic growth and underpinning secure and affordable energy supply is crucial in the region. Turbulence of international energy market caused by Ukraine war is making it more challenging for the region to achieve energy security and climate mitigation simultaneously. AREA, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, is actively conducting researches in the field of energy transition, reflecting ASEAN countries' respective carbon neutrality goals. While ASEAN and its member states are vigorously promoting renewable energy and energy efficiency, AREA's scenario analysis on transition pathways suggests that the role of fossil fuel will remain in coming decades as a baseload power to support growing energy demand within the region. Therefore, ASEAN needs to introduce not only green technologies, but also transition technologies for early, partial, and deep decarbonization in a phased manner. With this in mind, AREA published technology list and perspectives on transition finance in Asia last September to provide fact-based information about potential transition technologies. Development of transition technologies calls for investment. That is why transition finance is truly crucial. AREA is participating in the Asia Transition Finance Study Group to explore ways and means for facilitating transition finance in the region. The initiative, Asia Transition Finance Study Group, is a very important one and a timely one, involving a variety of stakeholders, policymakers, financial institutions, both public and private, financial and monetary authorities, investors, industries, and research institutes like us. Decarbonization pathway and the progress of the study group will be reported just after this by Mr. Nakahama from MUFG. Decarbonization pathway of ASEAN member states are different from those of developed countries. In order to realize pragmatic energy transition in this growth region, cross-sectoral collaboration and knowledge sharing, as we have here today, would be crucial and very important. For instance, government needs to prepare enabling policy environment and framework, such as decarbonization roadmaps, and provide policy support for transition finance that are aligned with their roadmap, including blended finance, for example. AREA is determined to contribute various fora, such as Asia Transition Finance Study Group and Asia CCU's US network, to facilitate dialogue among different stakeholders from this region to explore integrated solutions. I hope AGGPM will send a strong message emphasizing the need of balanced and pragmatic approach in pursuing decarbonization in this region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Watanabe. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Fumitaka Nakahama, Managing Corporate Executive and Group Head of the Global Corporate and Investment Banking, MUFG. Mr. Nakahama, please.
Excellencies and the honorable and distinguished guests and the participants, ladies and gentlemen, and good afternoon. I am Fumitaka Nakahama from Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, MUFG. On behalf of the members of the Asian Transition Finance Study Group, I would like to introduce our activities so far and the key findings this year. We would like to thank you for this great opportunity to introduce our initiatives to the leaders from the various sectors and the countries today. Please move to the page 2. First, we would like to revisit the importance of the balancing the key elements to achieve just an orderly transition in Asia. Major challenges in Asia are mainly from various economic and energy backgrounds. Each country has different levels of a current energy mix, natural resources availability, and economic growth. On the other hand, balancing 4 key elements, sustainability, affordability, and reliability, and social stability, is critical to realize Paris-aligned transition. The diagram also indicates that striking a subtle balance among the first 3 factors is necessary to maintain social security, social stability. If we fail to balance these things, we could not achieve a just and orderly transition. Please move to page 3. To achieve a just and orderly transition technologies will be the key. As you can see in the diagram from the IEA's Sustainable Development Scenario, shown in a red line, green technologies alone could not achieve that reduction target of the CO2 emission toward 2050. Transition technologies such as CCUS, hydrogen, and ammonia would be the essential for energy transition in Asia. Please go to page 4. With such understandings, Asian Transition Finance Group study, Asian Transition Finance Study Group was established back in 2021 as a private sector-led initiative. We aim to provide practical recommendations to supplement existing frameworks from a standpoint of transition finance practitioners, while there are various global standards and decarbonization pathways and taxonomies. Last year, we published 2 deliverables. One was Asian Transition Finance Guidelines to help financial institutions navigate through various standards and pathway roadmaps, taxonomies, as well as how to assess the sustainability of the transition finance. The other was activity report to share the challenges of the transition finance and the 7 support measures to various stakeholders. It covers the need of a government-issued decarbonization pathway and or roadmap and interoperability of the taxonomies, etc. Please move to page 5. Last year, the study group identified some remaining issues and addressed them this year through the various approaches. For remaining issue, we observed, firstly, complexity in application of the various references, including pathway, roadmaps, and taxonomies were articulated. Also, needs to go beyond FIs to accelerate transition finance were discussed. For example, lack of sector level or country level pathway or roadmaps interoperability of regional and the country taxonomies. This issue cannot be solved by the private financial institutions alone. Finally, our members also underscored importance of the identifying more granular level of challenges and potential solutions for concrete actions with the stakeholders to enhance the stakeholders' engagement more efficiently. More concrete data and the real voice from a financial institution would be helpful. To address these points, we focused the 3 pillars this year. Firstly, we reinforced peer learning opportunities to complement available references. The study group covered internal transition finance frameworks of peer financial institutions, a relevant transition finance guideline, and taxonomies. Secondly, we set interactive sessions with the public authorities and energy and industry players to identify necessary approaches and solutions from a broader perspectives. Then finally, we conducted a survey to ATF study group members to identify the key enablers to address the challenges for transition finance in Asia. Please move to page 6. In peer learning sessions, we collaborated with SFIA for hypothetical case studies and learned how to apply ASEAN taxonomy. The session highlighted that ASEAN taxonomy is an overarching reference to national taxonomies, and the financial institution need to carefully examine that technical requirement for the specific project when they decide an applicable taxonomy. In energy and industry sessions, we confirmed the importance of cross-sectorial collaborations to fill in the knowledge gap and find the de-risking solutions toward financing transition project. Some leading energy players emphasize that the governmental support to new technologies and the tailored transition finance assessment to each country's context would be essential. In the survey to study group members, it revealed that even among SG members, some banks received less demand for transition finance in some countries. Also, it highlighted that there are high needs for public support for de-risking measures, including blended finance, to scale up, mobilize the capital toward the transition. Please move to page 7. Summarizing these findings this year, we published the Asian Transition Finance Study Group Annual Report. In the report, we identified the 3 key enablers to accelerate transition finance in Asia. Enabler number 1 is about the strong mandates and the clear roadmaps and the pathway by government. Through the survey and the individual sessions, financial institutions highlighted that clearer transition roadmap and pathway by government would be the material first step. The survey shows that some financial institutions in some countries without clear decarbonization target have not received inquiries for transition finance. It implies that financial institutions and also transition finance receivers would not be motivated to take concrete actions if there is no clear governmental regulations or policies. Enabler number 2 is about the de-risking mechanisms, including government support to transition projects. The study group reconfirmed that transition projects with both mature and immature technologies are often facing challenges of economic viability, and that public financial measures such as incentive schemes and guarantees will be the key to overcome such challenges. This will be introduced in the next page later. Enabler number 3 is about the need for a simplified TF guidelines tailored for SMEs and data platform. Through the activities this year, some study group members pointed out that major transition finance guidelines available today would require a certain level of the capabilities. It could be challenging for MUEs, also challenges for SMEs to access reliable data, such as the GHG emission and the impact of transition technologies were also highlighted. Simplified transition finance guide tailored to SMEs and accessible data platform would help small and medium enterprise deal with transition activities. We want to share some more details about de-risking measures in the next page. Please go to page 8. For de-risking mechanisms, many of study group members share such needs for transition project. Key challenges we are facing today are the issue of economic viability. Projects by some transition technologies have an uncertain revenue stream or high cost structure. For example, newly commercialized technologies such as green hydrogen, ammonia, are still relatively expensive solutions amongst the conventional technologies. Also, from the standpoint of financial institutions and energy industry player, these players cannot provide finance or invest without justification of the economic viability. Therefore, additional support, including government measures, are necessary for such transition projects. In some countries, the government provides revenue support and a cost support such as a feed-in tariff, feed-in premium, contract for differences, and tax reductions for supply chain development to mitigate the risk of the transition project. International collaborations can also reduce the risk. Some energy and industry players emphasize the importance of the government's role, especially for emerging technologies. To approach to these enablers, the study group members and the guest speakers often mention the needs of the cross-sectorial collaborations. Still, there are a knowledge gap between the financial institution and energy industry players, as well as the public authority, especially for technological aspects. These stakeholders need to understand their needs for each other and seek for potential solutions. Please move to page 9. Based on these findings, we would like to continue to pursue 2 approaches as the next step. The first one is to accelerate collaborations with the public authorities and energy and industry players. As explained earlier, the key enablers cannot be achieved by financial institutions alone. For example, de-risking measures for transition projects require close alignment among various stakeholders. We want to accelerate this year's momentum to find helpful and feasible measures for practical applications. We wish to work more closely, especially with the public authority in the next phase. The second one is to continue to peer learning sessions. Throughout this year, we found there are some knowledge gaps among study group members. We also received many requests to continue the session with a broader and a deeper content, including transition technology aspects. By pursuing these approaches, especially through the collaboration with the public agencies, including energy and financial authorities, we would like to continue to find and share the challenges and the potential solutions to all stakeholders. Please move to page 10. Finally, we would like to thank you again for giving us this fantastic opportunity to introduce our outcomes. And thank you again to all ATF study group members for their input as well. Honorable and distinguished participants and guests, we look forward to further discussions and the possible collaboration with you in the next phase. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nakahama. Thank you very much. And before we move to session 1, we will take a short break for about 10 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back. Now we start the session 1. Let me introduce the moderator and the 5 panelists of the panel. This panel with the theme Financial Sector Industry Dialogue for Green Innovation and Pragmatic Transition in Asia will be moderated by Dr. Eliane Wolf, the Secretariat of the Asia Transition Finance Study Group. And I welcome 5 panelists on stage. Mr. Mushtaq Kapasi, MD and Chief Representative Asia Pacific of the International Capital Market Association. Mr. Eugene Wong, CEO of the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia. Mr. Fumitaka Nakahama, Managing Corporate Executive and Group Head, Global Corporate and Investment Banking of MUFG. Ms. Lisa Love Montelibano, SVP and CFO, CIO of the Aboitiz Power Corporation. And Mr. Wu Yen Bin, CFO of the Summit Power International. Dr. Wolf, please start with the panel.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us for this panel discussion to hear some of the stakeholders' perspectives when it comes to the Asia Transition Finance. And perhaps let me also open with a little bit of a different introduction of our panelists. So starting with Mr. Kapasi, who has joined us from the International Capital Market Association, ICMA, which is representing financial institutions, achieve the different Asia-specific and global transition finance considerations, pioneering really rules and principles. So, Mr. Kapasi, may I ask you to briefly share one or two of those activities?
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Wolf, and thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me. I'm very honored to represent ICMA here today. ICMA is a global trade association representing more than 600 institutions active in the debt securities market. So at its core, we are a bond market organization. We've been active for more than 50 years globally, but for the last 10 years, we've had the great honor to be at the forefront of developments in sustainable finance. ICMA's main contribution to sustainable finance globally is to serve as the secretariat, the organizing body for the green and social bond principles and related guidance, including most recently, the Transition Finance Handbook, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with today. The green and social bond principles now underlie more than 97% of labeled sustainable bond issuance globally. And we believe that the Transition Finance Handbook could play a similar role in the development of transition finance, which is extremely important, of course, in Asia, but globally as well. Very briefly, I will outline what the transition finance guidance from ICMA seeks to achieve. It attempts to help issuers give themselves credibility in the sustainable finance world. Basically, what it does is it requires for an issuer that wants to be involved in transition that they have a very robust strategy with adequate governance, that the strategy be material to environmental goals under the Paris Agreement as well as their own business. It requires then pathways that are science-based, that change over time and that include scope 1, 2, and 3. And last but not least, it requires transparency. The transparency has to be over time as well, include disclosure on things like operational expenditure and capital expenditure in furtherance of its transition finance strategy. We'll get into a bit more detail about that, but you are very free to visit our website and download the handbook for yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then let me move to our next panelist, Mr. Wong, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia, SUFIA, and is actively catalyzing ideas on sustainable finance. It also hosts the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. So perhaps, Mr. Wong, in your own words, if you could share one or two of those activities.
Thank you very much. So the Sustainable Finance Institute Asia is actually a catalyzing platform. So we are a convening platform to bring all the stakeholders together with the aim of promoting sustainable finance. And we do this through building the sustainable finance ecosystem. We see that this ecosystem has three pillars. The first being a common language that's taxonomy, and that's why we are hosting the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. The second is actually on transition pathways. And the third is on disclosures. And with disclosures, of course, we have two elements there. The first is actually on the way disclosures are made. And the second is on the data underlying the disclosures, because it's very critical that we get the right data to have meaningful disclosures. And it's, of course, no use if we have the three pillars to support the ecosystem, but there are no transactions. So we also try and promote the meaningful and very, I would say, mutually reinforcing demand and supply of sustainable capital, because this is really important to drive the agenda. So we work very closely with the governments and policymakers. As I shared with you just now, we are the host of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. And at the same time, we also work very closely with the ASEAN capital market regulators, where we collaborate with them to develop these three pillars, particularly in the capital markets. So one of the things I wanted to emphasize is that ASEAN is a very different region. We have 10 countries. Our member states have very different stages of economic development, very different stages of social development, and have very different resources at their disposal. So if you look at it, our highest GDP per capita per annum from a member state is $72,000, and the lowest is 1,300. But we are going to be the fourth largest economic bloc by 2030. We have common ambitions, so it's very important for us to be able to bring together all our member states to be able to drive the sustainability agenda, because many of our member states are actually very vulnerable countries to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wong. Next, let me introduce Mr. Nakahama from MUFG, member of the board, managing corporate executive and group head. MUFG is Japan's largest and one of the world's largest banks, and has been quite proactive in addressing climate change and really pioneering support measures. So, Mr. Nakahama, in your own words.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. As kindly introduced, my name is Fumitaka Nakahama from Mitsubishi UFJ Financial Group, and I'm responsible for the global corporate investment banking. MUFG is Japan's largest bank in terms of that balance sheet, with 3.5 trillion US dollars. And we are committed to contributing to the decarbonization effort of our clients. For ASEAN countries especially, historically we've been very active. The decarbonization efforts we work in is a first. We are the first Japanese bank to announce that carbon neutrality by 2050. Second, obviously, Asian Transition Finance Study Group, we've been committed to contributing as a lead among private banks. Third, we've been also active in a net zero banking alliance under the G funds. And we are playing the chairman of that, the subcommittee under the Net Zero Banking Alliance as for the transition finance. Our approach toward this decarbonization is engagement, not divestment. And I think that would be the key for today's discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then let me introduce Ms. Montelibano, who joins us. She is the Chief Financial Officer of Aboitiz Power, which is a Philippines-based utility company and domestically one of the largest power producers, also the largest owner-operator of renewable energy-based on installed capacity. So we are very excited to have you join the panel and a little bit perhaps latest activities of Aboitiz Power, if you can share.
Thank you, Lian. Good afternoon, everybody. So, well, first, a little bit on Aboitiz Power, who've been in power for 100 years. Aboitiz Power started in power in the 1920s in power distribution. And our heritage in power generation started in the 70s with hydropower plant development. I've been blessed to have been part of Aboitiz Power in the last 10 years, where we've greatly played a role in furthering or addressing the energy trilemma for the country of ensuring energy security, reliability, and sustainability. The next goal for Aboitiz Power is to double megawatts and to shift our mix to 50-50 by end decade. Very much aligned to what is the energy trilemma is trying to address in terms of security, equity, and sustainability.
Thank you very much. Then Mr. Wu joins us. He's the Chief Financial Officer of Summit Power International, an infrastructure developer and operator in South Asia, especially Bangladesh. Also established Bangladesh's first independent power plant and is now the largest independent power producer in Bangladesh. Mr. Wu, please.
Thank you, Elian. Thanks for the invitation for this panel. Summit Power International was incorporated in 2016 in Singapore. And as Dr. Wolf had pointed out, we are the leading energy infrastructure developer and operator in South Asia. Being the trailblazer in the Bangladesh power sector, we established the country's first IPP in 1997. Since then, we have grown to become the largest IPP in the country, owning and operating 18 power plants with a total capacity of 2,255 megawatts. We also operate the second FSRU of the country with a capacity of 500 MMCFDs. In terms of sustainability, this year we have embarked on drafting the sustainability strategy for the group, which involves setting targets for reduction in carbon emissions intensity, adding renewable power and clean energy power assets into our portfolio across various time horizons from 2030 to 2040 until 2050. As we embark on our decarbonization journey, what we realize is that it's really important for these targets to be suitably calibrated to the local development conditions of the countries that we operate in, especially Bangladesh. And we have to ensure that it conforms with the principle of the just energy transition, whereby decarbonization proceeds alongside continued social economic development of the country. Some of the specific initiatives that we recently started looking at include, in July, CIP and COP of Denmark has announced partnership with Summit Group to explore the development of 500 megawatts of offshore wind energy off the Bay of Bengal, which will be the first in the region. In early September, when Reuters conducted an interview with my chairman, we also mentioned about our plans to develop solar, wind, hydro, and energy storage solutions in India as well as across South Asia, with the eventual objective of importing renewable power into Bangladesh. So these are the key steps that we have taken over the past year or so in our journey towards sustainability and green transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Wu and all of the panelists. We're now going to discuss a few perspectives, and perhaps to start us out, a question that I would like to have each of the panelists comment for 1 or 2 minutes is, what are the challenges that stakeholders are facing for green innovation and energy transition in Asia today? So if you please think about your experience, your observation of your organization, to really understand the different perspectives that we are also presenting in the panel today. And Mr. Kapasi, if I could first ask you.
Sure, thank you. This is a challenging question, and unfortunately the challenges are many. What I'd like to do is maybe take a view from 3 angles, a very wide angle, and then go in a little bit. So from a global perspective, I think one challenge that we have in Asia in transition finance is that the national policies and energy policies have to be consistent with what we're trying to do in the financial sector. And I'm not an expert on that. I think that's a much broader discussion, but I think it needs to be highlighted. The financial sector alone, the securities markets alone, cannot solve the climate problems that we have today. There has to be consistency and support at the national level. And also this is important for the credibility of transition finance markets within each jurisdiction. Now, secondly, I think there are challenges in the overall financial markets. And what we've seen in the last couple of years is that the issuance in the green, social, sustainable bond markets, sustainability-linked bond markets, for example, which can be used for transition finance, is highly correlated to overall issuance in the global bond markets. So in Asia in particular, we've seen a big drop-off in international bond issuance for various macro factors, some national factors as well. That has led to or been correlated with a decrease in sustainable financing as well. And this is due to factors that are completely independent of sustainability or developments in the sustainable finance market. Now, thirdly, and probably more narrowly, is where ICMA is most involved. And this is within the sustainable finance world itself. And in the process of creating and trying to implement transition finance around the world in various jurisdictions. My coverage in particular is Asia Pacific. I'm based in Hong Kong, but I speak very frequently with many of the global stakeholders involved. I would highlight three main challenges that we hear from global stakeholders to transition finance. The first one is more technical in nature, and I think this can be solved. And basically, it's how do we define transition finance? How do we set standards for transition finance? How do we conceptualize transition finance? Is it something that we look at an issuer level, like we do from ICMA's perspective? Is it more about different technologies that are transition or not transition? Is it more about a product labeling, such as transition bonds? All of these can be valid approaches, but each of them creates some technical difficulties, and sometimes there's confusion about what the right type of approach to transition finance is. So I believe this is more of a technical problem. The second problem that I see, or the second challenge, is there's a perception among many stakeholders, especially those in the climate policy world, so to speak, or the general public, that transition finance is simply not fast enough. Right? There's a view, I think shared by many on this planet, that we cannot be in transition because transition takes time. We just have to immediately decarbonize and deal with the consequences as they arise. It's not enough to wait to do these things over time, to take a step-by-step approach. And this is a view that is prevalent among many in the global stakeholder community. And it's something that we have to discuss very carefully as we pursue transition finance. The third problem, and this might be the most difficult, is that there still remains a bit of a trust issue and a credibility gap. When you say transition finance in certain circles, there is a bit of doubt, there is a bit of hesitation, as if transition finance is not quite green enough, as if it could be somehow not ambitious enough, as if it could somehow be leading to claims that are not entirely true about the decarbonization trajectory and the ambition of certain projects or financing. I believe this is a difficult issue, but one that can be solved primarily through ambitious pathways, through robust strategies, and through transparency, as Mr. Harimoto has very eloquently put in his earlier address. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Wong.
Well, so I agree with everything Mushtaq has said. I'm not going to repeat it. But I wanted to emphasize a few things. The first is that it's a lot easier to talk about green. Transition's difficult because transition involves bespoke journeys. And when I say bespoke journeys, it's not just about a company, it's about a country and how the company fits within the context of that country. And it makes it very difficult to be able to map against a bespoke journey. It's easy to say, I'm going to invest in something green, and that's something not producing more than 100 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. That's easy, it's a benchmark. But you have to understand the journey for transition. Many people are actually scared of getting this wrong. And if you look at all the guidances that have come out, it is really quite daunting because you need to have so much data. You need to be able to construct pathways. Who has the capacity for that? If we're talking about the SMEs, and in Southeast Asia, we have 70 million MSMEs. That's a real challenge, right? So many people are paralyzed by fear. I think that would be one thing I would say. And we hear a lot about transition finance, but even as the ATF study group survey has shown, not everyone's getting inquiries on it because it is not that simple to execute. The second is technologies. Now, it's easy when we talk about green technology because we've had the data, we've had the feedback, the technology is good, it produces this result. Many transition pathways are forward-looking. In fact, all transition pathways are forward-looking, right? So if you're looking for something, it's not feedback, it's feed forward. Feed forward is always very hard to get. The third is, I've talked about capacity, so there's no doubt that we have this capacity issue, but we also have an issue with affordability. Not all technologies are affordable, right? So who is going to take the risk of technology, upfront investment, and in many cases, unproven technology, which may have a higher risk involved now? Who is going to absorb this risk? It is a very difficult challenge. So we have to be very conscious about what transition is. But the very important point I have to agree with Mushtaq is about moving. So in Southeast Asia, we have a saying, and that's perfect isn't good for Southeast Asia anymore. Because we've all been sitting, we've been waiting, we've been doing nothing. And if we don't provide the right catalysts, if we don't provide the right incentives to help people move on, what we're doing is either A, getting no action, B, getting greenwashing, or 3, putting people out of business. So we need to be very cautious. And I just have to end by saying this. I was coming in on the flight last night, and I watched a show, a Japanese show. So I'm sorry for all my Japanese colleagues. I'm spoiling the ending for you. But I think it's called Ichike's The Crow. And in that show, this small town had a factory, and the factory was no longer able to meet the compliance standards for pollution. And what the townsfolk did was to ask for help. And no one helped them because no one wanted to finance them to get out of this rut. So they ended up covering it. They were taking the pollutants out. People got poisoned along the way. And the whole town suffered. So if we are giving people no options through transition finance, we're going to see the same results. Other people are going to cover up, or no action is going to be taken. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this visualization as well, for this example. Mr. Nakahama, please.
Right, thank you. Again, I agree with all you gentlemen said, actually. So I try to be not redundant. Let me start with saying, when we say transition finance in Europe, that means the renewable energy directly. But here in Asia, when we talk about transition finance, is not directly going to the renewable solutions. The situation surrounding Asia is different from the Europe or the rest of the world, especially the restriction on the land, and as Mushtaq said, is a lack of that clear the kind of guideline. I think ICMA's effort is greatly appreciated, I think. And secondly, that for example, that coal-fired power station, and that people talk about early retirement of the coal-fired power station, but this is not the brand new project for the future. You have to make something end earlier than the regionally planned. It is quite difficult for the industry players and also private financial institutions to get involved. So I think definitely we do need a support from the government and the multilateral development financial institutions. One of the ways that we think is that perhaps we should leverage these MDBs and support as kind of leverage as by way of asking them to provide a project that concession equity. And finally, I think new technologies, as we discussed, again, I will be very short, that real world, in my humble experience, and when we talk members of the Asian Transition Finance Study Group, it is not easy for a credit officer to determine, am I doing the right things? Is this right? Is this are we going to be, I'm going to make my bank liable to the reputational risks or greenwashing? So we need to come up with very clear kind of guideline. I think that's one of that efforts that our study group members try to achieve. So,
thank you very much. Ms. Montelibano, please.
First, I wanted to say, Mr. Wong, I truly resonate with what you just explained, and I watched the same exact movie. How interesting. What you said, that in Southeast Asia, the pathways would really need to be bespoke. And that's where I'm exactly at as well. Because, balancing the energy trilemma of reliability, affordability, and sustainability is very, very complex. You need secure and reliable power to power human progress. You need reliable and affordable power for social stability and development. And the Philippines is at a stage of development where we do need a bespoke pathway and timeline that will still allow for the fullest human and economic potential. Our Undersecretary from the Department of Energy, I believe, was here earlier. The Department of Energy outlines that we're going to grow in our need for electricity 6.6% annually, year on year, until 2040. It means in 11 years, we need to have doubled the supply. With that kind of situation, we need all forms of energy to be able to support that requirement. Renewable energy today is 22% of our energy dispatch. And even if we wanted to build more, even if the government and companies like Aboitiz Power want to build more, there's a lot of constraints. Availability of land and complexity of land conversion. I tell you, pretty much all the land in the Philippines that has the irradiance levels required to make a solar power plant work is either agricultural or forest land. So you now end up hitting other issues as well. Transmission is very difficult. As we say, there is no transition without transmission. Delayed transmission projects have plagued the industry for a long time. We have we've had history of stranded capacities because the transmission is not there, long development cycles. There is supposedly 100 gigawatts of available RE service contracts under the RE law, but based on the grid expansion plan, only up to 28 gigawatts can be supported by 2030. So again, these constraints really come into play, and when you really come down to it, plain and simple, the complexities of managing the energy trilemma is very different for each country. How do you now end up putting that into consideration in the requirements for transition finance, I think becomes very complex. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mr. Wu, last but not least again.
Yes. Thank you very much. I really liked what you mentioned about the energy trilemma, because this is exactly what Bangladesh faces as well. For a population-dense country like Bangladesh, with limited land resources and less than ideal solar and wind resources, it is really challenging to implement enough renewable power at sufficient scale to meet the burgeoning demand of the growing populations. As many of the private developers in Bangladesh has experienced over the past few years, developing solar projects in Bangladesh with the land acquisition issues is really mind-boggling, and you can be tied up for many years just being stuck in terms of getting the land acquisition done. Furthermore, the intermittent nature of renewables means that you have to have robust energy storage systems, which currently is relatively unaffordable for a country like Bangladesh to develop at a large scale and a grid level to supply stable electricity to the entire country. And that is why when we calibrate our sustainability targets, we have to go back to ensuring that it meets the principle of the just energy transition framework, whereby not just do you have to balance the fact that we are all trying to get to sustainability, but how do we achieve it in a cost-affordable way for the population? I think in the context of South Asia, a holistic energy solution has to be able to sustain GDP growth of at least 8%, so as to enable to uplift large populations of South Asians from the deep abyss of poverty. And that is where we feel that, at least for Bangladesh context, as a first step, we can look at I think gas is still regarded as a pretty critical transition fuel within Bangladesh itself. Currently, it's about 55 to 60% of the grid. And as a start, we can think about replacing gas, replacing some of the more highly polluting sources such as oil, coal, with more efficient CCGT plants, for example. And also gas, if you look at it beyond the power sector, also plays an important role in industrial processes, especially those that require you to have high calorific fuels, and which is very difficult to electrify. And the role of gas has also been validated as part of the transition activity under the EU Green Taxonomy in 2022. I think this is where we really hope that, given that there are so many different standards in terms of transition, what counts as legitimate transition activity, what counts as transition finance, for each organization or in each country to take a view at each, we basically it's quite hard to have a one-size-fits-all approach for all countries, especially in the developing world. We really have to tailor it based on the local conditions and the development stage and the resources available for each of these countries. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you very much to all the panelists. And I think we heard a couple of themes around that there needs to be a quite Asia-specific answer, that energy transition itself has quite a different connotation across the region as opposed to globally, but also a country-specific solution that might be required. So I would like to invite Ms. Montelibano and Mr. Wu to please comment for your respective focus countries. What do you see as a realistic approach to realize energy transition?
First, I'd say the realistic pace to do transition is really first underscored by the technology, the available technology that allows you to do it in a reliable and affordable way. So given what is available today, we believe what is realistic is a practical and gradual approach that will wait or allow for technology development. In fact, I believe that if we really want to hasten the transition, a lot of the support has to go into development of technology, because once it's there, once it's economically viable, I think the rest will fall into place. So first is we need an affordable solution to renewable baseload, because even if we're building variable renewable energy, we know that, the sun doesn't shine the whole day. You need 4 times as much megawatts on solar to be able to produce the same amount of energy for coal. We're trying to play a role in looking for that solution. We've done several studies in the past year. We worked with IFC to commission a study to look for a viable configuration for renewable baseload. It is very challenging, but I think we all need to continue working, because that, I think, is a critical piece in solving this dilemma. Second is that there needs to be other technologies other than just solar and wind. We map the entire Philippines. Even if we converted all the possible irradiant land, not to mention agricultural issues that comes with, even if we convert all the possible irradiant land and wind sources, onshore wind sources, we will be nowhere near net zero. Offshore wind is a potential, but again, the transmission challenges for that is immense. We had one power plant that was one solar power plant that was half dispatched for 5 years because the transmission connection could not be completed. You can just imagine, if it is that difficult to connect something on land, how complicated it can be to connect something on sea. So it cannot just be renewables. It really will have to be viable, low-carbon solutions. We're studying hydrogen, we're studying ammonia, we're trying to understand nuclear. But unless there's breakthroughs in these areas, I don't think it'll become mainstream in the next decade or so. Gas will really have to be a transition fuel for us, and the Philippines is yet to develop in the gas space. Exploration and development takes a long time. We have Malampaya, and nobody really clearly knows how long it still has. Supposedly, the reserves there are already dwindling. So in the midterm, we're going to be relying on LNG, and there comes in again the affordability concerns that need to be dealt with. So we're also looking at how we can convert our existing coal facilities to be able to accept new technologies, like ammonia. And one of the things that we do think of in conversion of existing facilities is actually the topic of that movie. When you have large facilities where you have a lot of people relying on it, on employment, not just the employees themselves, but the entire community, there's really more aspects of sustainability that also come into play when you're thinking of, let's say, decommissioning very large sites. So we're thinking, how do you end up converting existing facilities to accept low carbon technology so that also support for the community, for the employees and their families is really taken care of? We are working with JERA to actually test co-ammonia firing in the Philippines. We're hoping that by 2030 would there be results, and we're hoping that by 2030 ammonia could be more affordable, because it really is very much not affordable for us today. So we're putting into all these things into place, but again, a realistic transition is really dependent on technology. It's looking for a way to be able to replace existing capacities in a way that really manages the balance of the energy trilemma.
Thank you very much. I think we share very similar sentiments with regard to some of the deployment of renewable power technology. In the context of Bangladesh, as mentioned earlier, one of the first steps that we can do on a national grid level is really to look at replacing some of the more polluting sources with gas. And for example, in the power sector itself, it could be the replacement of coal, diesel fuel, liquid fuel plants with more efficient CCGTs. On our side, because Bangladesh, as you know, also have many poor remote regions that are very difficult to connect to the grid. So what we have also started to do is to build micro and nano grids powered by solar in those remote areas. In fact, recently we have partnered with Friendship, which is the international social purpose organization focused on climate change adaptation, to roll out a 7.6 kV type of solar plant in a remote village, and with also battery solutions, water treatment plants, and ancillary facilities. So these are small things, small steps that we can take as well towards the energy transition journey. Other things, as I mentioned earlier, the challenges of rolling out large scales with solar, for example, in Bangladesh, is land. So what we can do is look at rooftops, floating solar. In the context of Summit, we have started to look at some of the building small-scale floating solar plants in various water bodies within our power plant complexes. If you go beyond the power sector, there can also be potential in, for example, replacing some of the diesel-powered irrigation pumps in the rural villages with solar pumps. However, the thing is that a lot of these technologies require more investment to bring them into fruition, to bring them down to a cost-affordable level. And that is why I think when we make our sustainability strategy, especially for the longer-term targets, it's dependent on we have to be flexible and make it contingent on the realization of certain exogenous factors. For example, one, the maturation of the technologies to the level that it becomes cost affordable for Bangladesh and South Asia in general. Like for example, JERA is also our strategic partner and is in the forefront of experimenting with ammonia and hydrogen. So we have also partnered with them to explore some of these technologies, and we certainly hope that one of these days it becomes cost affordable enough for us to be deployed in our power plants. By the way, our latest power plant, Megnahat 2, employs the GE H-class turbine, which is already equipped to burn a mix of natural gas as well as hydrogen when it becomes affordable for Bangladesh. And I think taking a step back, I think currently we also need to perhaps just do a slight pivot in terms of, or change the mindset in terms of how we look at renewable energy. For us, the world, to achieve no more than 1.5 degree warming, I think we need to focus not just on renewable power development or phasing out fossil fuels, because like for example, you said, even if you blanket the whole Philippines with solar, it might not get there. However, we think that some attention and efforts should be devoted to exploring some of the negative emissions technologies, CCUS, carbon abatement technologies, to bring it down to the cost affordable level that can be deployed on a large scale throughout the world and in poor countries as well. What is most powerful is that some of these abatement technologies can also be used to remove GHG from the hard to abate sectors, like some of the industrial processes and things like that we mentioned. This, we believe, is essential for pragmatic and a just energy transition process. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think Mr. Wu has already alluded to it. But my next question is a bit, what could help relevant stakeholders overcome the challenges that we've now been discussing? And perhaps we could build on what Mr. Wu was just mentioning. And Mr. Wu, anything to add to what you mentioned?
I think I would like to say that, for example, the Alliance for Just Energy Transformation, which includes renowned organizations such as UNDP and WWF, has promulgated 8 core principles of just energy transformation. One of the key principles, which I feel is especially relevant to South Asia, is principle number 6. Be centered on climate justice to ensure that the burdens of climate change, as well as the cost of avoiding it, are shared fairly, both internationally and intergenerationally. Implementation of the transition must support jobs, local communities, and improve the human well-being of the developing countries. This principle behoves the need for DFIs and developed countries to provide more generous funding to facilitate the energy transition journey of developing countries like Bangladesh, especially since much of the existing GHG levels in the environment is the result of relentless decades of fossil fuel powered growth by the developed world. And that is where it's rather disappointing to note that the 2009 climate finance commitment of providing at least 100 billion per year by 2020 to developing countries remains unfulfilled. South Asia as a whole has abundant renewable resources in the form of solar, wind, hydro, and biomass. These resources have the potential to bring power, clean, affordable energy to millions in South Asia. However, unlocking this renewable potential requires overcoming some formidable challenges in technical, regulatory, and financing. And that is where we really hope that the DFIs and the developed countries can provide funding to help finance some of these projects, as well as the expertise to structure bankable deals that can catalyze private funding sources. This can take the form of providing cover for lenders to mitigate political risk or for green bond investors. So these are some of the ideas that we've hoped. And of course, on the longer term basis, we also hope that DFIs and maybe the developed country can help to promote the development of regional grids in South Asia. As you mentioned, South Asia, it's a very diverse, broad spectrum. You have renewable-rich countries like India with solar, wind, hydro-rich countries like Nepal, Bhutan. If you have an effective and cost-efficient cross-border grid that allows the transmission of affordable green power from renewable-rich nations such as Nepal, Bhutan, India, to renewable resource deficient countries like Bangladesh, that is the day when South Asia can truly leave behind hydrocarbons and move toward a green net zero world. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wu. And perhaps picking up on one of your themes around the support from the financial institutions, from the financing, Mr. Nakahama, may I ask from your point of view, how could relevant stakeholders help to overcome these challenges?
Right. Thank you very much. As very well articulated, I think the bankability is an issue for project sponsors and the financial institutions due to the affordability or the lack of the materials, bunch of the reasons. So what been working so hard right now with, yes, development financial institutions or multilateral financial institutions like World Bank Group, if they have any plan to provide a guarantee, it's very financial technical things, but I think let me just share here, is rather than taking that, the risk of the senior lenders' risk, why these MDBs, multilateral development financial institutions, can take a so-called first loss type of the guarantee, more closer to equity or mezzanine type of things. As such, the senior lenders or sponsors could, to some extent, enhance the economic viability. Of course, private institutions like MFG also should seriously consider sharing the risks with the MDBs, financial institutions like World Bank Group. In addition to that, more in the real world, MUFG has been working very closely with the METI of Japanese government, and also the NEXI is Nippon Export and Import Credit. It's insurance guarantee agency, 100% owned by Japanese government. We have entered into the MOU with the NEXI, I think back in the August this summer, to try to establish such a blended finance, a type of the fund. From the private bank's perspective, if a project are rated, for example, externally rated by Moody's and S&P's, under the Basel rule, the private banks are allowed to reduce its risk-weighted assets. So return on risk-weighted asset will be getting better. It's much easier for commercial banks to be engaged in such challenging renewable project than before. So these efforts should be seriously considered. And most importantly, let me talk a little bit about the grant from the government. Grant is just a grant. $100 million is just $100 million. But if these grants can be used as concession equity, this equity could generate or could be used as a leverage, and it could mobilize the fund from private sector beyond the banks, i.e. that nowadays MUFG is In terms of the global project finance league table, we've been always global number one. But the bank is having a difficulty in putting its project finance assets for 15 years or 20 years anymore, given that Basel requirement. Nowadays, life insurance company is more suitable in a way to take and hold such project finance. So for these institutional investors, important thing is that externally rated. So it could be that traded in that secondary market. Sorry, I'm talking a little bit about too much technical things, but in order to mobilize private sector fund, these things structure will be critical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think this technology, this technical aspect is an important one to discuss, as is something that was mentioned earlier, which is around the collaboration that is really required between the stakeholders as well. So to a little bit shift gears, I would like to ask Mr. Wong perhaps around what kind of collaboration would be beneficial to the stakeholders.
Let me first start off by recollecting the first time I was asked in a large group what transition is. And I said that, so they asked me to say it in a phrase, and what I said was transition is actually the marriage between ambition and reality. And why do I bring this up now? Because as I hear my fellow panelists speaking, I'm reminded by this very fundamental issue. The problem for us, which we need collaborations to address, is that right now, transitions are actually a very fragmented area. Desperate but fragmented area. And it is very important for us to remember that while we have ambitions, there are a lot of realities we have to deal with, right? Everything from infrastructure that's lacking to social justice. I think, again, it's very important to remember that it's about the people. And if you look at the ASEAN Taxonomy version 2, social aspects have been incorporated. So you may qualify on all the environmental technical screening criteria, but if there is some form of social injustice, human rights are being violated, communities are being unfairly treated, you no longer qualify because it is about the people. So we need to be very cautious about this, and this is not an easy thing to do because, as I said, developing and emerging nations face very, very different challenges which we have to address. Now, one of the problems we see today is that there are a lot of well-meaning rules. Let's talk about ambition, right? Because I said it's the marriage between ambition and reality. So the ambition is 1.5 degrees. But let's look at this part of the world. Let's look at how many people are affected by climate actions. What happens if you can't reach 1.5? So if you have projects that don't meet that 1.5 degree target, it could be well below 2 or maybe even slightly below 2, but that's the best they can do given all the limiting circumstances we've heard about. Don't finance them. So I think one of the biggest issues we have here is a common understanding that takes into account different starting points. We need collaboration around this, and we need it now. Because one of the frequent things we hear is that people who need transition finance go to an FI and the FI says, oops, sorry, I'm bound by a 1.5 degree target. Can't do 2, below 2. And of course, you can't blame the FIs because the FIs are following the herd. That is the general direction. So the first thing I think we really need to be effective is an understanding amongst FIs and the private sector, how far they will go in supporting transition. The second is governments need to give them cover. Because, in the old days, for people old enough like me, if you bought a computer and you bought IBM, you could never go wrong, so you'd buy IBM, whether it's the best or not. The same thing, you need cover. Because if governments came up and say, this is the best we can think of, and FI say, fine, we'll follow that, then at least you get some action going. An example I give you is the coal phase-out criteria in the ASEAN taxonomy, the first taxonomy in the world to actually have a criteria for coal phase-out. And why was this done? Because the governments heard from certain stakeholders that there was no consensus and no one knew how to move, And the governments decided to give cover by saying, this is the best we think we can do right now. Of course, we hope things will improve later on. The second is a very important point Nakama-san brought up, which is actually de-risking. Now, we have a lot of concessional capital, but actually there's a lot less, in my mind, and this is a personal opinion, than what we hear about, because countries are facing their own issues with managing their own domestic crisis, economic crisis and energy crisis, defense, so there's less. So we must be very judicious in the way we are using our concessional capital, right? It's best to leverage that concessional capital, like you said, through de-risking. It's not about grants, it's not just about pure equity or loan investments, it's about how you use that to take away the risk, that small portion of risk, which is dissuading everyone from investing. The third area of collaboration is really on capacity building, because we look at capacity, whether it's the users of capital or the providers of capital, it's really not there. And the fourth is really informed decision making. We have no data. The truth is we have no consistent, timely, comparable, and reliable data. We need to collaborate to make it cheap and easier for users of capital and providers of capital to be able to collect that data. I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And perhaps building on this environment, a question to Mr. Kapasi. As the environment of transition finance continues to evolve, how could the Asia Transition Finance Study Group also, that you've been discussing with over the last couple of months, these activities contribute to solving potential issues in this area?
Sure, thank you very much. Wow, I feel very humbled with the expertise and some of the wonderful points and arguments raised by the fellow panelists. I think just very big picture, I think having this dialogue on a global basis would be very important, and to the extent the ATF can help to facilitate that, it'd be super useful. I can tell you from experience that conversations about transition finance are very different in Paris or New York or San Francisco, and probably could be enhanced by the direct experience of those involved in sectors that are central to transition in Asia, and the real on-the-ground experiences of those. In terms of the ATF itself, I've read the new report with a lot of interest, and from a personal perspective, in my position at ICMA, I would find two things worth expanding upon and worth going deeper into. One is the case studies. So I think this could be helpful in two different dimensions. One is to help and guide and inspire potential issuers in Asia, many of whom are interested in sustainable finance, but maybe are not as far along the path or as sophisticated in sustainable finance. We often get asked, who else has done this? What have they encountered? Why are they doing it? Why should we do this? So having examples of successful case studies and how some of the problems have been solved along the way, very practical problems, could go a long way. Actually, it's also very relevant to the points on coal phase-out, looking at what exactly does it mean to finance coal phase-out. In a way, it's taken a while for me to get my head around it, because you're financing the closure of a plant. What does that actually mean? What are you spending the money on? Is it replacement? Is it new capacity? Is it to address some of the social issues, perhaps? Is it other things? So hearing these stories, I think, could be very powerful. And the second dimension where the case studies could be very helpful is, again, giving credibility in the global space to transition finance, to be able to show those who might be more skeptical around the world that this is a successful implementation of transition finance. This is, getting back to the data point, how it actually has positive impact on the climate and how it is in line, hopefully with a 1.5 degree scenario, but at the very least with a 2.0 degree scenario under the Paris Agreement. And one final point as an appendix to that, I think the discussions about technologies and the development of technologies is actually very important, and I think the expertise in Asia and the sophistication is probably ahead of that around the rest of the world. I think it almost struck me as a little bit of a surprise, and probably I should have known this, but I'd never thought to think about it, that even if we develop renewables to full capacity, that may still not be enough, and that we still may actually need the new technologies, whether it be new renewables or semi-renewables, new transition technologies, or new technologies to help reduce emissions from traditional fossil fuel generating sources. I think those could be explored more from the ATF, and that could contribute to the global discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And given also the framework and the environment of today's discussion, perhaps to think a little bit about the stakeholders, the wider stakeholder environment, such as governments. What is the expectation towards such stakeholders to accelerate energy transition in finance, especially to finance and energy authorities? Ms. Montelibano, if you could share some of your thoughts regarding such expectations.
Support from the government, and for us in the Philippines, we've had that discussion already, that transmission is very needed. We need to actually upgrade our grid so that it can accept more variable renewable energy. We need to be able to expand our grid so that projects can be connected. I say that what we need. I remember one day I was in a meeting with Department of Energy, and they were explaining to me all the complexities of how we can get the grid expanded, and that itself is another 2 hours perhaps of discussion. So I say that is what is needed, and I know that our government is looking at it, and I know that it is in itself another world of complexity. In fact, perhaps some angles of the transition finance could go into helping address or finance complexities that are underlying also constraints that we have with the grid, which in turn then puts constraints on us being able to build renewables faster. You mentioned it earlier, this infrastructure. It's really not just building the projects, it's really the infrastructure also that needs to be developed for us to be able to do the projects. To do offshore wind, we need better ports. We're looking at it, we're dreaming of it, and when we're starting to understand all the infrastructure required to do offshore wind, okay, it gives me a little bit of nightmares at night. So all of the support in terms of infrastructure, ports, transportation, roads, to be able to move the materials. When you actually do hydro projects or solar projects in far-flung areas, we actually end up also building the roads ourselves. In some projects, we end up building the transmission ourselves, and we will be asked to absorb it in project costs. So it's really support for infrastructure also to, as it is, the projects are risky, the project is expensive, and we need to also spend on the infrastructure on top of it just to be able to do it, is indeed added burden to making this happen.
Thank you very much. And then perhaps, if I may ask the final perspective from Mr. Nakahama on exactly this question as well. So the expectation towards the stakeholders from a financial institution's perspective.
Thank you. Yes, I touched upon a couple of times. First, the private financial institutions also have to work very hard for this objective. But the government provide export credit agency type of that support. Now, these government support for these project for the banks, in a way, as I just briefly mentioned, in the guarantee type of things, but also the contracts for the differences in order to support more usage of the hydrogen, ammonia, for example. That would be the base for the off-takers to think about, to seriously consider entering into the long-term off-take agreement, for example. And as for the multilateral development financial institution, again, I think it's, let's take the example as in a World Bank Group. the size of the World Bank Group is limited, but the needs for decarbonization finance is huge, gigantic. So I think it's the World Bank could think about having a specific KPI for private capital mobilization, for example, rather than making their balance sheet is bigger, rather how they can provide catalytic type of the capital to mobilize more fund from private sector through the bunch of way, I think, as blended finance, securitization, or guarantee. Our job is to make these things our job is to make a difficult project bankable. And then we should be in a position to encourage institutional investors or sovereign wealth fund or even the private equity fund at the moment, which are not involved in this world, to encourage them to make it, the investment, a transition finance is attractive to these people. So we do need definitely support from ICMA, SFIA. So we are here to work together to see the brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with working together for the brighter future, let me pick up on this and thank all the panelists today for this discussion and finding a solution together. It is, as you were mentioning, it is a start. The transition does take time, and we learned, thanks to your insights, it does need a very Asia-specific perspective and a country-by-country view, but at the same time supporting each other across not just countries, but across industry, public institutions, financial institutions. So this is an important mission for the Asia Transition Finance. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you for the audience.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all panelists. Thank you very much. This is the stage layout that has to be amended, so please wait for a while until the second panel starts. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience. Now I'd like to introduce the second and the last panel with the theme, the role of research institutions in pragmatic transition in Asia. Joining us on stage is the moderator, Mr. Niyamaru Shani, S&P Global. We have two panelists on stage, Mr. Jun Arima, Senior Policy Fellow on Energy and Environment area, Ms. Tae Tamura, Deputy General Manager, Natural Resources and Energy Team, Industry Research Department of the Mizuho Bank. And live from the United States is joining us Ms. Jane Nakano, Senior Fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Mr. Shani, please begin with the panel.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, and to our esteemed panel, a very good afternoon from Tokyo. We're here today to really look at one very important aspect of the energy transition, which is the role that research and think tanks play in supporting these decisions around the energy trilemma, the pathways that countries are adopting towards their net zero climate ambitions, as well as to be able to seed the right inputs based on ground realities, maybe pragmatic realities about how the transition could progress in various parts of the world, including here in Asia. So today we are joined by a very esteemed panel. Let me start by introducing Tamura-san. Ms. Tamura joins us from Mizuho Bank. She is the Deputy General Manager for Natural Resources and Energy from the Industry Research Department of Mizuho Bank. Joining us virtually is Ms. Jane Nakano. Jane is a Senior Fellow in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at CSIS, which is one of the leading think tanks in the world, which needs no introductions. And then along with us, we're really honored to have Mr. Jun Arima-san. Arima-san is a Senior Policy Fellow for the Energy and Environment at Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia fondly known as ARIA. With that, let me now turn to my panel, and I'm now looking at you, Arima-san. We have several transition bottlenecks which have been identified over the last few years. We've had various sessions of COPs. I'm sure, with ARIA, you've also done a lot of good work in this area of both the transition and transition finance. Can you now share with our audience, what is ARIA focused on and the way you see, the roadmaps unfolding, the challenges and the opportunities that it presents?
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. And ARIA is an international organization based in Jakarta, established in 2008, and its activity is very much broad, particularly focusing on economic integration. But in recent years, the energy is becoming more and more important in the research areas. And you said, the bottlenecks for energy transition. We need to first consider the energy situation in Asia, unique energy situation in Asia. First of all, in Asia, economic growth potential is very robust. And so therefore, there is very much robust economic, the energy demand growth is expected. Accordingly, CO2 emissions will also increase. And second, the energy mix is very much dominated by fossil fuels, in particular coal, because coal resources are very much abundant in this region. And in addition, there are so many coal power plants in this region, and their vintage is very much young, generally, less than 10 years. So therefore, the immediate phase out is very much difficult. The third, priority on climate mitigation. We are facing multiple, say, sustainable development challenges, SDG 17, and among various SDG targets, the priority for climate action is relatively lower compared with those in developed countries. So we need to squarely face that reality first. Then the bottleneck for energy transition first. Perhaps I think all the ASEAN countries or Asian countries have put forward very much ambitious carbon neutrality goals, but that are not necessarily backed by robust roadmap or pathways. And second, those pathways are not, say, necessarily backed by robust policy measures for make that happen. And third, in order to make that pathway happen, they need to make proper access to the finance. But that is also insufficient. So ARIA, our organization, in supporting Asia Energy Transition Initiative proposed by Japan, we have been engaged in various activities, including the technology optimization scenarios, assuming the respective carbon neutrality goals by each ASEAN member states, and then developing a technology list for early, partial, and deep decarbonization. And third, participation in the Asian Transition Finance Study Group, which is a major topic in the previous session, and that was presented by Mr. Nakahama today. And in terms of transition finance in particular, as pointed out by many speakers, we think that the clear roadmap or pathways by the government is absolutely necessary for making clarity to the private sectors so that they will have a demand for those transition finance. And second, preparation of appropriate policy environment, including tax regulation or supportive measures, including carbon tax, carbon pricing, and so on. And also, in order to make a transition finance accessible, probably the government need to provide some support, like a blended finance or public fund or something. Again, this point has been very much articulated by Mr. Nakahama in the previous session. And finally, we definitely need some sort of fora for dialogue among various stakeholders, because energy transition needs to be promoted by public and private and by diverse stakeholders, including energy ministry, energy companies, and also energy users, and also financial authorities, financial institutions, and so on. So those, how can I say, fora for dialogue and stakeholders are quite important. And that is definitely one of the objectives of the ADF, Asia Transition Finance Study Group, because they have been offering the fora for session through learning sessions or one-to-one dialogue and so on. So, and area would like to also contribute to those activities facilitating energy transition in this region. And our activity is not limited to roadmap or transition list or study group, but also we are engaged in various specific policy analysis, like an Asia Zero Emission Community support, and also the managing of Asia CCUS network, and also analysis of hydrogen, biofuel, and carbon pricing, and smart cities, and so on. So in short, the role of energy transition in our energy-related research activity is getting bigger and bigger, and we will continue to provide our input. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those insights. Jane, I'm now looking at you, Jane-san. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, I'm able to hear you.
Great. We just heard about some of the important work ARIA is doing in this area. And thank you so much for joining us remotely. I know it's a very odd hour for you out there, and I think everybody here in the audience appreciates you joining from the US, at this time. It'll be great to get your perspectives, as CSIS or, as one of the leading thinkers at CSIS. What is your view and expectations from governments in Asia, especially when it comes to either, gas or LNG, which is considered a bridge fuel, or even the cleaner gases like hydrogen and ammonia? And what are your perspectives on the role that, CSIS or the US could be playing?
Sure, thank you so much for having me. As an independent think tank that has been looking at energy issues since 1970s, I mean, CSIS itself has been around since 1960s, but the energy program has been around since the latter half of 1970s. Things have been changing quite a bit. I mean, Asia has become really one of the key engines of the global economy, and in many ways, I think we're still in Washington, trying to get a solid sense of the scope and pace of the energy transition that's needed in Asia for the entire global energy transition to be a success. Our work has looked at the different types of attributes of energy resources, including natural gas. The US has become one of the leading global LNG exporters. So in that context, we always try to inform US policymakers, whether in the executive branch or the legislative branch, about different benefits that the US LNG export has brought to the region. Stronger sense of energy security in Asia, lowering the sort of access to the fuel, and also more recently, where we have a robust research work on hydrogen and ammonia. But my expectation is that, and I think Asia is quite big, and I think how some of these fuels will, the future will play out will be somewhat. It depends on whether you're in Northeast Asia, particularly in the case of Japan and South Korea, very much dependent on maritime transportation. So how fuels like hydrogen as energy carrier gets transported, through shipping, really changes the economics, right? And so this whole supply chain development that some of the Asian countries are really investing in is something that we follow very closely. And as a think tanker, we always try to inform U.S. Both the business community, but also the policymakers, because I think I think there are different ways that different fuels will contribute to the energy transition. But also CSIS has about over 20 different programs. So energy program does cooperate with some of the researchers that look at different regions full time, whether it's, India, Middle East, different regions that also have, sort of a natural gas, export potential, or perhaps even hydrogen export potential, and really try to understand in much broader context than perhaps some of the sort of market analyst colleagues do. There's geopolitical lens that we try to bring to the conversation, and it's not just the economic and technology realities, but also foreign relations. Within the United States, it's really important to obviously try to explain diversity among the Asian countries' approaches. But also what we do is to have conversation with think tank colleagues from Asia and try to sort of explain some of the complexities within the U.S. policymaking that may not be as obvious. The sort of tension sometimes of the federal government policymaking and different state level, subnational. Actually, the subnational is a bit of a misleading word in the energy policymaking within the United States. Sometimes a governor could be as powerful as the president of the United States on some resource issues, and it's in that context that we think tanks like CSIs could really try to have a better to improve everyone's sort of collective knowledge and try to highlight really viable pathways. Now, let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Jane. Tamura-san, when we look at some of the work which you're doing, what is Mizuho Bank's view on this transition, and what are your thoughts on the key challenges which are facing this situation?
Okay, let me introduce Mizuho Bank's approach to Asia's energy transition. Mizuho Bank's approach to sustainability and energy transition is unique. We believe that our strength comes from the combination of financial expertise and our in-depth industrial knowledge. In terms of sustainable finance, we have an outstanding record of being ranked as #1 sustainable finance league in Japan and ranked #1 in the Asia Pacific top tier in the Sustainable Finance Loan League table. I work in Mizuho Bank's Industrial Research Department, and this department has been active for over 50 years. About 100 analysts cover a wide range of sectors, from energy to manufacturing and services. We also have global teams in Singapore, Hong Kong, New York, and London. This global network and our strong relationships with leading companies, not only Japanese companies, but also Asian companies and government, allow us to have a meaningful insights of mid to long-term industry strategy and outlook. By leveraging our unique capabilities, we can help shape the ideal future of industries and companies. Regarding the challenges facing energy transition in Asia, we would like to start from revisiting that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Each country has its unique geographical and political characteristics. Each country's energy supply system has been established over a long period, considering complex factors such as geographical conditions, energy availability, and others. The disruption of such energy supply systems immediately poses major concerns for people's lives. On the other hand, it is necessary to transition from the existing energy supply system to the future energy system, which can address to the long-term sustainability goal. Hence, the energy transition needs to be smooth and orderly transition while ensuring no disruption of energy supply. The future energy supply system must be a unique system that considers the relevant circumstances of each country. Asian countries require diverse options for decarbonization, not just limited to renewable energy. They consider other decarbonization solutions such as hydrogen, ammonia, CCS, and others, as Mr. Arima and Ms. Nakano mentioned earlier. At the present moment, there is few roadmap or direction for a new energy supply system for Asia that takes into account its complexity. Therefore, energy transition discussions frequently refer to successful cases in other regions. However, various unique challenges in emerging countries become the bottlenecks, such as difficulty in expanding investment in emerging countries, lacking environmental regulation, and limited support for the cutting-edge new decarbonization technologies. While it is essential to address such bottlenecks individually, it is even more crucial to consider Asia's complexity to develop a unique path towards a future energy supply system. A common understanding that the path towards decarbonization is not the path, but a path is important. We also would like to share the understanding that there are no the future energy supply system. There are various future energy supply systems, and the goal of energy transition will differ by country, even though we share the premise of net zero. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamura-san. And I think what we've achieved in the last few minutes is to get different perspectives from thought leaders in their own domains on defining what some of these issues or bottlenecks are. What we'd now like to do is to pivot to some solutions or ideas based on the work that you're doing. So starting with you, Arima-san, can you share with us some of the and perhaps maybe with some examples how ARIA is really supporting this transition and making some unique efforts in this pathways for carbon neutrality?
Thank you very much. And one of the unique contribution by ARIA is providing the roadmaps and also pathways for achieving respective carbon neutrality goals by ASEAN member states. And as I said, the ASEAN member states have put forward very ambitious decarbonization goals, and then they are making vigorous efforts by enhancing energy efficiency and introducing more renewables and so on. But that does not guarantee the achievement of, say, respective carbon neutrality goals either in 2050, 60, or 65. So, and as Tamura-san said, the mitigation pathway for respective country is very much affected by energy endowment in each country, and also energy mix, and also potential for various intermittent renewables, and also potential for CCUS and so on. So in order to provide input, ultimately that pathway needs to be developed by each respective country. They have a sovereign right to develop such a pathway, but as an input to their consideration, under the initiative of ATI, as I said, we have been conducting technology optimization scenarios, assuming the respective carbon neutrality goals, and covering various technologies such as CCGT, solar and wind, and nuclear, and also ammonia, hydrogen, and CCUS, and DACs and BECCS. And also we have, in some cases, took into account the removal potential, like a carbon sinks. And then we also presented the stepwise the energy transition pathway from now to 2050, 60, and so on, together with the marginal abatement cost and also potential impact to the electricity prices and the gasoline prices. So that is one of the strengths of our analysis. And also, after presenting that, each country's technology optimization pathway, we are now being engaged in dialogue with individual countries, whether our assumption is right and whether we should we should add another assumption and so on. So that kind of dialogue is going on. Then, ARIA is developing a biennial energy outlook as an East Asia Summit energy outlook, EAS outlook, once in 2 years. And in the past, we have been developing a BAU scenario and also advanced policy scenarios. But from last year, we have added new scenario that is low carbon energy transition and carbon neutrality scenarios. And in this case, we are engaging dedicated energy experts from each country. So from the beginning, we are engaging them in developing that outlook. And those, technology optimization scenario and areas outlook suggest that, we definitely need stepwise approach. Decarbonization cannot happen overnight. And for example, in the short and midterm, the switching from coal to natural gas is the most, pragmatic solution for reducing carbon footprint from power sector. And also, since elimination of the young coal power plant overnight is impossible, so the co-combustion between coal and ammonia, or co-combustion between natural gas and hydrogen, ultimately, neutralizing CO2 emissions using CCUS, that is the most, sensible approach. And of course, the variable renewable, that share will increase definitely. But according to our analysis, even in 2050, the share of their total power generation is more or less 50 or 55%. So we should note that renewable is very important, but that is not panacea. So the role of hydrogen, ammonia, CCUS, in particular after 2040, is quite important. And these scenario analysis suggest the necessity of transition technologies, and then in turn also suggest the necessity of transition finance.
Some very interesting points, and I want to, get your thoughts on one question before I move to Jane-san on the work that CSIS is doing, and how you could see some of these debottlenecking initiatives for the pathways in Asia. You mentioned a few very important facts that most people are aware about the transition, which is, one, it is not overnight. Tamura-san mentioned that, one size fits all is not the solution here. But when you talk to policymakers and share your views, what are the reactions you get?
Very interesting question. And for example, from my own experience, when we gather the energy policy makers in such fora as East Asia Summit, Energy Ministers Meeting, or Energy Cooperation Task Force, that perspective that one size doesn't fit all, or energy transition cannot happen overnight, that is widely shared. But I'm also a former, negotiator of the climate negotiation. And when we go to COP, then we hear a completely different story. I don't know whether you have been to COP, but if not, you should go there, because you will listen to completely different story. There, they are talking about, say, immediate elimination of fossil fuels from investment, and fossil fuel phase out, or stop fossil fuel investment immediately. So that is not reflecting the reality in this region. And so my personal sense is, so it is our concern is there is a growing disconnect between the energy dialogue here in Asian region and climate dialogue in COP.
So Jane-san, let me bring you in on this very important point, saying there's a different dialogue happening here in Asia, and I think a reference to whether COP or any of the other major platforms, a different dialogue going on there. CSIS is such an important think tank. You have a very responsible role of conveying key messages. How do you see the transition in Asia? What is your expectation from stakeholders here on especially debottlenecking some of these challenges which we've seen?
Thank you so much. So I cannot agree more with what just Arima-san said. I think there is, within Washington, a lot of decarbonization conversation is very transatlantic based. And, I don't know if it's, just that some of the Asian stakeholders, are, shy. I'm not entirely sure, but there are a lot of technology-based, viable pathways that the Asian policymakers and business leaders are working on. But those voices are not heard as much, or let me be very careful. It's not that Washington, does not want to hear. It's just, they just don't get, you just don't hear it as much. Maybe it's the volume of the voices. And I think, the United States is both a Pacific nation, but also the Atlantic nation. And I think, the United States is in a position to be able to bridge that gap. And as a think tank that looks at not just sort of an energy and climate in sort of a singular context, but much more in a foreign policy and larger context, I think CSIS type think tanks have a very important role to play in bridging. And I also wanted to also mention that the CSIS energy program does not have a specific sort of a dedicated project that looks at energy transition or has something very concrete like road mapping that the area does. But most, if not all of our policy analyses and recommendations actually do touch upon energy transition in Asia. And some of the considerations, trade-offs that Asian policymakers are faced with, right? So, but some of the specific things that the CSIS has done is to put recommendations to the Department of Energy recently on this hydrogen hub creation. The U.S. hydrogen approach is not driven by the desire or explicit interest to export it. It's not seen as a important underpinning factor to make hydrogen economy develop within the United States. I think there might be enough consumption here as well as production. But our report highlighted how if the United States is serious about decarbonization around the world, and if we think that the hydrogen, when I say hydrogen, by the way, it includes various carrier types, so including ammonia, obviously. But if we're serious about it, then export what we can bring to the market, just like what we did with LNG, is a very important consideration, particularly for Asia. So we've also looked at the green industrial strategy issue. Even 2 years ago, actually, before it became this popular, and looked at how some of the more of a protectionist inward-looking impulse is not really helpful to the United States and to our economic partners, including in Asia. So how do we build out more of a win-win approach to this, whether it's under this notion of a friendshoring, etc. But also, some of the issues we've looked at are as Europe tries to shift away from the Russian natural gas. How can we try to make help Europeans ensure energy security, but then also make sure that the U.S. LNG infrastructure does not become a stranded asset? And in that context, we've also looked at how then potentially some of this sort of a U.S. EU interest in additional LNG supply from the U.S. could later benefit some of the Asian countries that are still really striving to shift away from coal. So those are some of the specific aspects. But again, I think they're all much really in the sort of big context of regional economy, but geopolitics and foreign relations.
Thank you, Jane-san. Now, Tamura-san, when we look closer to home here, as Mizuho Bank, what is your expectation from the government in Japan and also the other Asian partner governments when it comes to promoting the transition in Asia?
Yeah, I would like to talk this as both a think tank and a financial institution. Firstly, from the think tank perspective, we are grateful that Japanese and Asian government created the opportunity to build a knowledge network like today's event. We believe that we should continue to create such opportunities and work together to draw a vision of Asia's unique path within the network. We also want to show Asia's voice to other regions that demand a uniform energy transition. From the financial institutions' perspective, Asia Transition Finance discussed earlier is expected to expand, and we want to promote and share the transition package with the best practice for transition. It is ranging from developing a strategy and framework for transition finance to the execution of the finance. We want to emphasize the significance of transition finance, not only to the energy sector, but also its positive impact on the regional economy and communities. As transition finance can take different forms, it would be appreciated if we could create more model cases that support various companies to take the first step towards transition, such as initiatives that promote the use of best practice or provide support towards relevant bottlenecks. It is anticipated that Japanese companies will collaborate with Asian utilities to contribute to the decarbonization of their thermal power generation with financial support from Japanese financial institutions. In fact, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries has started feasibility studies in Indonesia for the conversion of coal power plant to biomass, coal-fired ammonia, and gas power plant to coal-fired hydrogen. I would like to request continued support for finance to contribute to the decarbonization and low-carbon transformation of thermal power generation by government financial institutions.
Thank you so much, Tamura-san. And are there any specific policy inputs or interventions that you think are needed to achieve this green growth in the industries, as well as to inspire the private capital or private investment to support the energy transition?
For
one thing, we can make a roadmap, and based on the roadmap, the financing can be given by way of support.
Is going to be required would be the roadmap creation, and also the financial support would of course be required here.
Thank you. Arima-san, now looking at you, I think we're all aware there's enough statistics that whether S&P Global or other organizations have put out, or Arya is also aware that Asia is where the future of energy is going to be centered. If we look at economic growth, if we look at population growth, if you look at energy demand growth, Asia is the hub, it is the center. With this growing demand, as some of the work that you're doing, what are your expectations, from either governments, from a policy-making perspective, or the private sector, whether it's just private investments or public-private partnerships? What risks should government take and what risks should the industry take? How do we keep this balance?
Okay, thank you very much. And I think keywords for energy transition in the Asian region is just, affordable, and inclusive, and clean. So there are 4 adjectives, and you can add more. And in order to achieve these, say, multifaceted energy transition in a pragmatic manner, the role of not only government, but also private sector is quite important. Obviously, a government needs to take a lead. And as I said in my the first initial remarks, there are a lot the government needs to do. First, as Tamura-san said, preparation of the roadmaps, and also the policy measures for supporting that roadmap to be implemented, including tax and regulation, subsidy, carbon price, and so on. And this is easy to say, but not easy to do. And look at our country, Japan itself. We are now continuing our subsidy for gasoline prices, facing with energy price hike. And also we are extending the government support for maintaining electricity price lower. So that is something like a negative carbon tax. But looking at political reality, we have to do that. So it is the case even in developed countries like Japan. So imagine what would be the situation for developing countries where energy demand, energy price is very much the digressive in the lower income families. So this is very much tough, but definitely we need to do it. And also this will also increase the demand of transition finance, today's key theme. Because without a clear, say, vision and without clear policies, then there will not be sufficient demand for transition finance. As Mr. Nakara said, the not sufficient inquiry about transition finance from private sector. That's partly due to the lack of clear vision by the government. And also for de-risking transition finance, as I said, the blended finance or public fund or such kind of, the government needs to take a risk to some extent for making various transition technologies bankable and economically viable. And also, as the private sector is the ultimate driver for decarbonization, so they need to be engaged. They need to be engaged by various ways. But one of the most important thing is the government needs to show the clear, how can I say, perspective about the future cost for decarbonization. We should not fool ourselves that decarbonization can be achieved without any additional cost. Rather, we need to bear our cost. Then the government need to show what would be the implication to the energy prices and so on. Nevertheless, they need to get support from, say, private sectors, including industrial sector and household sectors. Otherwise, just the ambitious goals will stay as a pie in the sky. And then finally, the role of international organizations like us, unlike the OECD and or IEA, the ASEAN member states very much respect the sovereignty. So we cannot force them to do something. So at most, we can provide the input for their considerations. So that is why we have been engaged in various policy analysis and also roadmap development and also the list of technologies. But still, a list of technologies are very much indicative one. And also the guidelines of the finance as presented by previous speakers and the setting up of the follow-up. But I think I'd like to very much emphasize the power of international organization as a convening power, because international organization has a strong utility by convening various stakeholders in such fora as Asia Transition Finance Study Group or something. And there, one of the big homework from this year's activity is we need to enhance the dialogue between various, the stakeholders, including energy ministry or and dialogue between energy ministry and the financial authorities, and also engaging more energy industries, both energy producing industries and energy using industries. That kind of perspective could be enhanced through such fora as, say, a learning session or one-to-one dialogue and so on. So that kind of convening power is one of the few areas where international organization can make a tangible contribution.
Jane-san, you're representing another very influential and powerful organization on this panel. Like Arima-san mentioned, there's a strong role that think tanks and international organizations play or need to continue playing to support a pragmatic and a just transition. When you look at Asia, from your perspective, there are several energy sources and technologies. I think Asia is where an all of the above approach is imperative, and some of the points which you alluded to earlier in terms of what maybe the governments in the West, or the global North or the global versus the global South debate, which seems to be a perpetual one, continues to focus on renewable energies and electrification of the fleet, moving molecules to electrons. But there is a clear role that natural resources have to play, which includes fossil fuels. So what are some of these key economic security considerations that you come up or you think of when you look at energy security in Asia vis-a-vis the need to balance it with the climate goals?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that really important question. I feel that maybe 3-4 years ago there was this excitement that as more and more OECD economies, particularly in more transatlantic side of economies, started having extremely ambitious and very rapid decarbonization targets, and then in that context, trying to reduce reliance on fossil fuels. There was also sort of there are also some studies undertaken about the geopolitical implications of that energy transition trend. And I think one of the main arguments was that this energy transition could really solve many of the energy security concerns. I feel it's fair to say that that has not really turned out to be the case. I think energy transition and dependence on different mix of fuels comes with its own challenges. It's not to say that it's worse or anything. It's just that greater reliance on renewables and also EV, electric vehicles, do require more critical minerals. These are mineral content intensive technologies. So, but of course, the good thing is that it probably has different set of regions that come into focus. So it's not just one region in the traditional sense of oil geopolitics. But that certainly is does pose some of the economic and perhaps geoeconomic considerations. I think some of the specifics is when it comes to critical minerals like rare earth elements, we've come to understand how dependent many economies are on just a handful of countries for both mineral extraction, but then also processing capacity. There are a lot of economic reasons, but then also there are a lot of just past trade practices, etc. And I think the idea here is that the energy transition would be better served if we could diversify pool of suppliers of these minerals, but then also pool of countries that do have capacities to process them. Because we learned during the COVID, the coronavirus pandemic, that some of the minerals that were meant to be exported out of Africa, particularly, I guess it was the Congolese cobalt, got stuck in South Africa when port had to go through some sort of a human resource or labor, schedule constraint because of the pandemic. So, whether it's the geopolitical tension or whether it's another pandemic or natural disaster, I think we've learned that supply disruptions are real. And in order to mitigate that or to safeguard the energy transition that we desire, it's important to really work on these supply chain and market issues. I also wanted to note that in the context of the energy transition and certainly this requirement for minerals, I think there's also growing concern over inequity, the sense of inequity among some of the resource-rich countries, including in Asia, developing Asian economies, and I think it's that could become an economic or sort of a geoeconomic challenge. But I think this is also an opportunity for many of the OECD economies to get it right this time. The energy transition requires all the stakeholders at different stages, but in order to have a successful one, I think the relationship between the global north and the global south, as Nirmal, you put it, I think that's it's really easier way to, I guess, sort of picture. But in order for that partnership to work out, the relationship needs to go beyond extractive or just a trade import and export type of relationship. So how do we become partners with global south in value chain development? So that's something that's still ongoing, and the U.S. government has been investing a lot of money and human resources into multilateral partnerships, such as the Mineral Security Partnership. So it's something that warrants a lot of attention. And if I may just quickly add, I think there's also the traditional sense of energy security concern associated with lower carbon fossil fuels. And I think in Washington, I've been very clear about how real the economic shock has been on Asia from the Russian war, from the EU's commitment to shift away from Russian fossil fuels. It's not in just the shift away, but then also to reduce, I guess, the dependence on fossil fuels. But that's not something as well appreciated, outside Asia, perhaps. So, the way in which the LNG price hikes have ended up, reducing the LNG import in South Asia, Southeast Asia, that in turn ended up having coal to come back, hopefully for, temporarily. But I think, these economies are much more price sensitive. And I think it's extremely unproductive for, it'd be very unfortunate, if there continues to be this sense of inequity, certain countries will not be able to access, cleaner fuels, but others can continue to afford, but then, sort of prematurely, constrain the access would be really detriment to the stable economic growth in many parts of the world.
Jane-san, can I put you in a spot here? Based
Sure.
on what you just said, about the lack of appreciation, can you, in your view, what can be done differently, or what more or less needs to happen to get this appreciation level, to something which is more pragmatic and more inclusive?
So appreciation for, I'm sorry, the Asian energy security challenge? Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you for that question. One more, I think precisely, I am very, honored, but then also pleased that, the Asian policymakers are open to having, US-based think tank to be part of this dialogue. But I think more could be done to be featuring voices from Asia in some of the discussions in Washington. And it's I think, more and more policymakers and business leaders are starting to do that. But again, I think sometimes the, impression is that sometimes it's a little more about, how do we navigate what's, happening in this decarbonization conversation, area. And sometimes it doesn't seem that voices of Asia are sort of geared towards trying to shape that conversation. It's a little more like, we're here to, understand what's happening in maybe Washington or Brussels. But maybe quietly, governments are doing that, but not in sort of a think tank field. As Arima-san said, one of the values of think tanks is it has convening power, and there's no, we do not represent any sector, we do not advocate, we do not lobby, and this is a place that anyone with ideas come and then test it out and try to shape how policymakers may be thinking about this issue the next time it comes up to write the legislation or get the speech ready for international conference. What's the range of ideas that are out there? Are there more people that actually think like you but may not be as vocal? So I love to see much more conversation, and I certainly think that we think tanks like ours have have more work to do. So I'm not just putting it on the Asian policymakers, but I think it's a collective efforts that are required.
It truly is. I think it's truly a collective effort, and at S&P Global, we're doing our part, playing our part by convening CERAWeek in Houston every year for the last 4 decades. And we're very clearly focused on elevating the voice of Asia at CERAWeek next year, working very closely with governments here in Asia, especially in Japan, to make that a reality. I do know that we have to wrap, so maybe Arima-san, let me start with you by asking you to not just give a quick...
Yeah, thank you very much. And, my friend Jane has already very much, eloquently articulated her points that we need to make Asian voice heard, not only in this region, but also in more broader global set of discussions, such as COP or others. And the growing rift between the energy dialogue and climate dialogue is quite apparent, looking at the difference between G7 communique and G20 communique. They have a clearly different devotion to 1.5 degrees Celsius target or 2025 peaking out goals or something like that. They are not on the same page. We need to squarely face this reality. And then, the Western organizations, Western governments, and Western, say, NGOs are very good at setting de facto standard. And de facto standard could also affect the future, say, regime of transition finance and so on. And transition finance is particularly important for this region for achieving just an orderly transition. So therefore, Asian countries need to, say, make their case in various global settings, such as COP and so on. And in the COP, environment ministries of member states are attending. And I don't know to what extent they have a very much sufficiently close communication between the environment ministry and energy ministry or development ministries. And so I think they should enhance their the in-house internal communication, and also in certain cases they need to make their voice heard. And I recall that the Indian environment minister at COP26, he strongly resisted to the coal phase out proposed by the UK government, and he made a clear case that for such countries as India, coal phase out immediately cannot be accepted. So at most, we can accept coal phase down. So that is a rare opportunity, rare cases that Asian countries made their voice very much clearly on such a fora. And I think this sort of, don't be shy. You could make a case in various fora. So that is the message I'd like to deliver on this occasion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamura-san. So don't be shy, I think, is the message for leaders from the industry who may be in the audience or listening to the program online, as well as for some of the key policymakers, who are sitting here with us today. Jane-san, may I now look to you to, share your final thoughts on this very important topic?
Thank you. As someone that's representing a U.S. think tank, I like to emphasize that I think the United States does have an important role to play in bridging this trans-Pacific and transatlantic sort of a dialogue gap. But and that's not just because Asian energy transition is so key to the success of global energy transition, but I also think that it's important for the U.S. leadership to be one that's that is robust with a lot of technology and technical and market-based sort of underpinnings, because a lot of really the economic growth in Asia is just very essential. But also, I also do not want to, I guess, dismiss the importance of ambition. I think ambitions are important. You have to have, the direction, clear direction, and how far, how fast we want to go. That doesn't mean that anyone who is, seems apprehensive about whether they can, keep that whatever pace, the speed, shouldn't be, shouldn't be like embarrassed, if you will. I mean, I think there are a lot of different realities and constraints, but I think it's really, something that, U.S. think tanks are all striving in each way to make sure that the U.S. leadership will be the strong and effective and beneficial one to the global energy transition by really having the balanced, input and having as robust and frank conversations with not just, global North, colleagues and then some of the, partners from the global South, but also from different regions, from both, still fossil fuel heavy economies in perhaps, the Gulf, as well as much more, faster, I guess, clean energy driven economies. So, but again, this I very much enjoyed, even though virtual participation, very much enjoyed the conversation and very much looking forward to staying in touch and working with all of you on this important agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane-san. Tamura-san, may I now request you for your final thoughts, on how the role of think tanks can be furthered in the pragmatic transition pathway decision making.
Thank you. I'd like to talk as a wrap up that energy transition's path will not be one size fits all. Asia is considered the most complex and unique region with increasing energy demand, requiring us to balance short-term energy security and long-term energy transition. And we recognize the need to use various measures such as promoting the use of renewable energy resources and utilizing comprehensive strategies. And it includes the utilization of natural gas as a transition step toward energy transition and transitioning from natural gas power plant to hydrogen power plant and using CCS to draw a long-term energy supply system. And of course, we, Mizuho Bank, as a financial institution, wants to combine our capabilities in finance and industrial knowledge we have cultivated since the past to play our unique strengths. Furthermore, as a think tank, we have a strong and long-standing relationship with government agencies and companies. We believe that we can contribute to knowledge networks like today's event more by utilizing these strengths. And of course, people expected to us to invest new technology, but it's very difficult for Japanese bank to invest cutting-edge technologies because we don't understand what's the best technology in the future. So it's very struggle for us to invest new technology, but we want to research and we try to understand new technologies, and we want to try to contribute Asia's energy transition. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And I'd now like to request a round of applause for an amazing panel discussion that we've had with a group of eminent panelists from different parts of the world. May I have a round of applause, please? Well, that brings us to the end of this session. I'd now like to hand over to the hosts for the next announcement.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.